Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Cuphead? It's been making the rounds as of late. You can't really fail to notice for a variety of reasons. An old-school platformer, although primarily a 2D boss rush game in the vein of Contra. Brought to you by Team Meat. Nope, not Team Meat. Studio MDHR. And it has gained attention primarily for its old-school cartoon aesthetic, reminiscent of very old Disney cartoons, a soundtrack to match, and a rather large difficulty curve, let's just put it that way, that takes you to dizzying heights of pretty damn difficult boss fights. Let's have a look at the options menu before we start and talk a little bit about this. So, full disclosure as always, WTF is a first impression series. I do not finish games with this series at all. I play them about as much as I feel like I need to in order to get my opinion sorted out, and in this case, I played through the first world, beat all the bosses there, beat all the levels there, then basically watched Dodger play most of it, I think. I've seen most of the bosses in the game. It's actually quite a compelling stream viewing experience, mostly because of the schadenfreude that you can get from watching people literally scream at this game for its punishing difficulty on some bosses. That's what to expect out of this video, and I can also tell you this from the very start that 2D boss rushing and platforming are two of my least favorite things. Take that into consideration when considering my opinion. Alright, menus. Pretty basic. Audio. Sound effects and music volume sliders. Crank that music up as high as it goes, because it's very, very good. Not much on the visual side of things. A few annoying aspects. For instance, it just flat out lies half the time. Right now I'm in a windowed mode, it claims it's in full screen. It continually keeps setting VSync back on, which breaks my G-Sync, which isn't particularly nice, and more often than not, even when I set it to full screen resolution, it actually puts it into borderless, which is not the same thing at all, despite it being capable of exclusive full screen. Does that make a great deal of difference? Well, no, this thing will run on a toaster. In fact, people made that abundantly clear by running it, apparently, at full speed on a GPD Win, which I believe is an Intel Atom-based handheld made in South Korea. So, I would say that you should probably not have too many issues, although some weird frame drops have been occurring for some people. I got it a little bit as well. It required a restart, and I also saw that Nerdcubed got it on his stream. His frame rate dropped below 30. It's odd. It looks like it's a fairly rare performance bug. It's not really indicative of any major performance problems across the board, but if that does happen, I would recommend a restart or trying to switch between windowed and full screen mode. That seems to fix it for me. Controls, right. So, if I had any recommendations, one, you play this with a controller, not a keyboard. The reason is you've got 8-directional aiming, which is not particularly easy to do on a keyboard. And even with the controller, the default layout is something I really don't like. So they've set it up in a way that emulates an old-school platformer, which would be the D-pad and the 4 face buttons. Well, unfortunately, most of us aren't using controllers like that anymore. We're using trigger-based controllers with analog sticks. If you use the default configuration, I found that it's actually rather difficult to utilize it properly. So what I did was, I rebound a couple of things. Specifically, I rebound shoot to the right trigger, and I rebound dash to the left trigger. These made things a hell of a lot easier, since you can then shoot with the right trigger and then aim using the analog stick, which is much easier. Applying jump to A helped a lot as well, so mess around with it a little bit. If you find it difficult to control initially, I think the default bindings are unintuitive and really could have used a more modern twist. Alright, let's dive in and show you what's going on. So according to this, I've beaten a quarter of the game. This takes me to Inkwell Isle 2. I'll show you some of the stuff I've already beaten and the expectations that you should be setting yourself when going into this thing. So, it is primarily a boss rush game. It does have platforming in it, and I'll show you one of these. They're called run and gun segments. Now, initially, the game was never supposed to have these. It was designed as a boss rush game, first and foremost. However, they did decide, later on in development, to add platforming segments. So, if we go to the very first one, dive into this first level. You may have seen it on a certain video whose name will not be invoked on this show, lest indeed I summon the devil upon me. And these are very standard platforming and run-and-gun levels. You need to move through at a reasonable pace because enemies respawn, so hanging around isn't really going to benefit you much. You have a dash, which does not, I believe, provide invincibility frames, but does allow you to dash over long distances and avoid certain attacks. And in this case, I'm using a Contra or Gunstar Heroes-like homing weapon. There's a loadout system in this game, which allows you to equip 2 different kinds of weapons, as well as a different special and a charm, which will affect certain aspects of your character. Now, the homing weapon is very good for run-and-gun levels, not so good for bosses because it doesn't really do a huge amount of damage. But since you have an 8-directional aiming system that, unless you lock yourself to the ground using the lock button, is going to involve you moving if you aim in any other direction than backwards or forwards, the homing weapon is very useful because it avoids the vast majority of that as a problem. You can mostly just focus on the platforming and not dying to that. Makes things a little bit simpler. Otherwise, though, you'll find that a lot of people, especially if you watch streams, are actually using the default weapon, which is this, the pea shooter. And the reason being is this seems to have the most consistent damage and also has a very powerful EX attack, which is what I just used there. Now, the game actually has a parry system in it, which is a bit of a weird choice for an old-school platformer, but there are certain things, not everything, but any projectile that is pink, you can parry. And if you parry it successfully, which requires a double jump timing to do it, and don't screw that up if you can avoid it, then you will be rewarded with an EX point, which will allow you to fire your EX weapon. Pretty handy. And that is a mechanic that's often used in the bosses as well. And it's a bit of a nice little risk-reward system, because nailing it is a little challenging. Requires quite precise timing. And it will also result in you getting a better grade. You know, so they'll get a decent amount of HP. If I had actually parried something, I'd be able to get a higher grade than that. So if you want to A+ everything, you've got to get 3 parries throughout the level and all that kind of stuff. But really, the game is about bosses. So I'm gonna show you one of the really easy ones, and then show you one that's a little bit trickier. This is what the majority of the game is going to consist of doing. Multi-stage bosses, which are all, frankly, extremely creative in terms of their appearance, and have their own unique theme music as well, which is absolutely fantastic. Now, generally speaking, these bosses will have set phases, but they also have different sequences of attacks that they can kind of mix up. So even though, you know, he's always going to summon the Onion as phase 2, the Onion could do different attacks, he could do different attacks, so it gives you a little bit more variety, and it also makes the boss a little harder to learn. I like the fact that they vary it up like that, because it means that it's not just an exercise in muscle memory and repetition until the end of goddamn time, which is one of the main problems I have with a lot of boss fights. You know, they're just very repetitive, especially the harder ones that need an awful lot of work in order to properly practice. Not the kind of thing that I personally really enjoy all that much, as you're probably keenly aware. Never really been into boss rush games, and this is what this game is. If you approach this as a platformer, you'll probably be fairly disappointed, simply because there aren't all that many actual platforming levels. They're used to break up the monotony, I suppose, of just doing all bosses, and probably make the game a little bit more appealing to a wider audience, because when people heard it was just bosses, they were actually, in many cases, quite disappointed. I don't mind the platforming levels. I think they're okay. They're certainly not the star of the show, and it's very clear that they were put in after the fact. Not a bad little grade on that one, I would think. Solid B? Yeah, I'll take it. There we go. But they're okay to break up the monotony. They also put in some bosses where you actually fly a plane. So I'm going to head on over to one of those and show you what that's all about. The plane has some different moves, and also certain loadouts available as well. So that also helps vary things up just a wee bit. So let's do the Threatening Zeppelin. This is a little bit of a more challenging boss fight, so I'll probably get my arse kicked on that one. And I apologize for that one in advance, but hey, never been massively good at these games. So as you can see, you've got access to the plane here. And rather than a dodge, you actually have a shrink, which will speed you up, but make your attack much weaker. And you have different supers compared... Oh god, I was not quick enough on that one at all. Compared to your regular Cuphead. Honestly, I think that the bosses probably had enough variety without this, because there's just such a sheer number of the damn things. There are a huge number of bosses in this game, and they're also very well thought out in terms of their number of phases. But the aircraft segments do also have a kind of platforming element to them, because of course they involve consistent movement, and that's used on certain levels in certain phases to put you into positions where you actually have to navigate little mazes and avoid obstacles. That helps, again, break up the potential tedium of a boss-heavy fight. Boss-heavy game, as it were. It works really, really well, and it's pretty obvious that the aesthetic and the music are the stars of the show here. But if I did have any complaints about it, it would be in the feedback that you get from actually hitting things. There's not an awful lot of it. Now, outside of switching phases, the bosses barely react to actually being hit. You have this very light little white flash, which occurs every time you hit them. But your weapons otherwise, ironically, well, not so much ironically, perhaps appropriately, feel like pea shooters. I mean, your main weapon is literally called a pea shooter. And I don't really find combat all that satisfying if my weapon is going to... I almost beat it in one shot. It's a shame I messed that up, but never mind. We'll go and check out another one. I'm not really a fan of games where my weapon doesn't really feel like it's doing much. And as I've explained in previous videos, particularly when dealing with first-person shooters, this is a bit of a nightmare one, I believe. There are a couple of different ways of making a weapon feel impactful. Sound effects is a big one. You know, you make it sound like it's a powerful weapon, and while the sound design in this game for the music is absolutely phenomenal, and the voice acting as well, the sound design for the weapons is anemic. Extremely anemic, and I'm not expecting things to sound like assault rifles. I mean, for God's sake, you know, it is a cartoony game, but the weapons barely make any noise, which unfortunately adds to the feeling that they're not really doing much. Since there's also no health bar, you don't really have much of a visual indication of doing damage other than going from phase to phase to phase. And the little white flashes are not particularly satisfying. I don't feel like I'm really being rewarded for beating the living snot out of these bosses. So, damn it. That was a stupid thing to do. So that's one of the main problems I've got with it. You know, it feels like you're just beating your head against a brick wall more often than not, simply because you're not getting that really satisfying visual feedback. Now, there was one boss where it seemed like, you know, they had actually got a grasp on that idea. The boss turned into a giant gravestone, and at one point it actually cracked a little bit. And I was like, is this an indication that I'm doing more damage to it? I don't think so. I think it's just a pre-scripted part of the fight, but I think that would be a really good idea in most of these fights. Just have more visual indicators that you'd actually done serious damage. I'm just messing up here horribly. And that, I think, would not only give you a much better idea of where you are in the fight, but, you know, a good solid visual indicator that you're doing well and that your weapons are actually doing something. That's sort of, it's something of a nitpick, but it definitely reduced my enjoyment of the boss fights overall. You know, it is a game about shooting things. If the shooting doesn't feel all that satisfying, then there are going to be issues there, one way or the other. I think that should be fairly obvious to pretty much everybody. Outside of that, though, the aesthetic and the music are absolutely phenomenal. No real question about that. They absolutely invoke precisely what they were trying to do, which is remind you of really old Disney cartoons. They're able to give character to almost anything. You know, in this case, you've got an evil-looking flower. There was an onion, and a really upset onion, a couple of boxing frogs. That's the real strength of the game. Every single little thing that's in it has some character. Ironically, to the point where I think that actually their main characters, the Cupheads, may be the least interesting things on the screen at any given time. Which I guess is probably for the best, because they do want you focusing on the bosses and what the bosses can actually do. But it is interesting that your main character is probably the most boring thing in the game. Now, ultimately, I'm not going to play any more of Cuphead, because while I think it is magnificently accomplished what it set out to do, which is present a number of incredibly creative, visually stunning, varied bosses that are going to give you a huge challenge to work through. And motivate you to do so, by the way, simply down to the fact that you want to see what the next crazy phase is. You want to see what the next crazy boss is. That's where the design and the strength of the aesthetic actually make a real difference. I think it's easy to just say, well, the game's got good graphics, and that's really nice. Yeah, but in this case, because of the strength of design, because of the strength of the aesthetic, you are motivated to continue to play and fight through stuff that is otherwise extremely hard. So this boss, for instance, I've seen people fight this. I never fought this one before. I am going to die immediately, I would imagine, on this thing. You just want to see more. You want to see the next phase, the next incredible, really well-designed boss that they have to throw at you. And a little bit of progression in terms of your loadout and being able to buy new weapons and upgrades, although they are all side grades, to the point, as I said, where almost every streamer just seemed to use the default weapon. And Dodger in particular was of the opinion that the default weapon is by far the strongest. I like the homing weapon, especially during certain boss phases, to switch out, particularly if it's like I can't get a good solid aim at the target because of the way that I'm forced to move to avoid things. I think the homing weapon is nice to be able to maintain damage. But otherwise, I can kind of see her point. The things that you could switch between all seem to be side grades to the point where that main gun, perhaps the least interesting gun in the game, is probably the most effective. Regardless of all of that, though, it's a beautiful game. It's an incredibly challenging game. And if you have the patience for it, I imagine you'll absolutely bloody love it. I don't have the patience for it whatsoever. I'll tell you that for a fact. No chance. Absolutely not. It's not my sort of thing at all. But it's accomplished what it set out to do, and I think, once again, games like this and games like Super Meat Boy prove that more often than not, the industry doesn't seem to have a bloody clue what it wants, or what the consumer wants. They obviously did want an ultra-hard boss rushy kind of game with a cute cartoony aesthetic and occasional platforming segments. They did. Apparently I failed, 57 times. Not bad in, 5 or so hours of play, I guess. They want it. They're rewarding it with their purchases. They're rewarding it with their stream views. They're rewarding it with high reviews, overwhelmingly positive critique across the board, and excellent feedback. And who's to argue with that, really? It's certainly not my kind of game, but for the people that did want this sort of thing, they're gushing over it. And I think I can see why. I can clearly see why, and the ability to see why something is good without personally enjoying it is a useful skill to have, I think. I certainly don't have the skill in platforming, but I can see why people really, really love Cuphead. No doubt about it. Cuphead, ladies and gentlemen, available for $20 or your regional equivalent on Steam. Also available on GOG, and of course you can pick it up on Xbox One. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means, do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And I'll see you next time.
I'm Mr. King Dice. I'm the gamest in the land. I never play nice. I'm the devil's right-hand man.